I'm Carl King, and welcome to the Carl King Podcast, where I, Carl King, talk about music, filmmaking, and general creativity stuff. To support this podcast, head on over to patreon.com/carlking and help me fund my creative projects with $1 a month or $5 a month. Or if you're like Chubode and Hank Howard III, you could even join at the Archmage level of $50 or more per month. And by the way, Hank Howard III has taken the top spot back at $50 and 2 pennies. And let me tell you, those 2 pennies go a long way towards buying Carl King some gluten-free pasta. So thank you. Quick shout out to my music endorsements: Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ball Strings, TuneCore, and Millennia Media. They make amazing musical gear that I love to use. So let's prepare to begin to get started. In this episode, I'm going to announce the new book I wrote. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the process of re-releasing my first Sir Millard Mulch CD to streaming platforms. After that, we'll have a special guest segment from Dale Turner. He's going to tell us some hilarious behind-the-scenes stories about famous guitarists he's interviewed for magazines. Subsequently, I will answer some listener questions about my evolving opinions on music, Carl King's name, and what Carl King is reading. And I'll wrap it all up with a rant about robots. But before we do any of that, let's issue a Carl King health update. As always, it's 94 degrees F here in Los Angeles, alternating between freezing and sweating in my studio, thanks to my intense AC unit. Just a few minutes ago, I got back from the doctor because I truly believe I have sleep apnea. Because I'm old and, things are going wrong. One of my dad's favorite sayings was, "That's what happens when you get old." Regarding the sleep apnea, I've been waking up multiple times a night, gasping for air. And I'm trying some simple things like wearing a chin strap and sleeping on my side, but it is still happening. This is a bad thing because sleep apnea is related to heart attacks and strokes, due to the long-term damage it causes. So the doctor scheduled me for an at-home sleep test, and all in all, the whole process of ordering the test, taking the test, sending the test back, and getting the test results will take about a month. If it comes back positive, which I expect it will, I'll get to sleep with one of those CPAP machines attached to my face, with the mask and all the tubes sticking out. And I'm looking forward to that because I love having tubes near my face. In other news, I'm finally recovered from COVID. I just have a slight remaining cough. How about that? So now that you all know I'm kind of doing okay, let's talk about the new Carl King product. Another Carl King product? Yes, because as Mark Borchardt says, quote, "Carl King is the creative engine that could," unquote. Carl King has written a new book. Can you believe that? It's called Robots and Aliens, Deep Liner Notes, 1996 through 1999. It's 126 pages long, and it tells the story of recording the first Sir Millard Mulch CD, called 50 Intellectually Stimulating Themes from a Cheap Amusement Park for Robots and Aliens, Volume 1. Will there ever be a Volume 2? No one seems to know. Anyway, that's the album that contains the songs A Brief History of Broccoli, 15 Interesting Things to Do with Tiny Chairs 1 and 2, and The Boy with the Perfectly Square Butthole. All the classics, all the hits. Anyway, I call the book Deep Liner Notes, but it's also a memoir. It's full of candid photos, handwritten music notation from back in the day. It's got crazy flyers and artwork, weird magazine clippings, reviews, and a bunch of memories of my wildly creative, strange friends. I talk all about my college years in Florida, my mundane day jobs, and my personal brand of scrambled anxiety and pathological ambition, as well as my track-by-track observations for all 53 of the tracks. That's right, this CD has got 53, well, you can't call them songs, but they are technically tracks. The book is a story about a weird guy and the weird environment his weird album emerged from. And where can you get it? Well, Robots and Aliens is a PDF download, and it's only available to my $5 and up Patreon patrons. Also, it was edited by Chris Higgins, so go get it at patreon.com/Carl King. Speaking of Robots and Aliens, I'm in the process of getting that Sir Millard Mulch 50 intellectually stimulating CD re-released through digital and streaming, which has not been easy. I have encountered some problems. I usually use CD Baby for all my digital releases. So the other day I was in my CD Baby account for a couple of hours creating all the tracks, typing in all my ridiculously long song titles, hating myself for naming things that long back in the day, researching and entering all the cover song, songwriter, and publishing company info. You can imagine how fun that is. So after hours of doing this, I get the artwork uploaded and everything, and the final step is to upload the actual audio files. And just as I'm going to do that, this stupid notice pops up that says, "Sorry, we have a limit of 50 songs for uploading. If your album has more than 50 songs, you have to mail us 5 copies of your CD." Well, my album has 53 tracks, unfortunately, so I was just over the limit. Now, I think this is ridiculous because what year is this, CD Baby? The amount of audio tracks I can upload to your form should at this point be unlimited, and there's no way I was going to burn 5 copies of a CD with Toast or whatever and mail them to Portland. For those that don't remember, Toast is a piece of software that you would use for burning physical CDs. And of course, the Toast is also a cult from my animated show, The Oracle of Outer Space, if you've ever seen that. So out of frustration, I headed over to TuneCore, which is another company that I've used in the past. Something weird I've always noticed about TuneCore is that they charge you the setup fee before you can even proceed to do anything, which is fine, I guess, like whatever. But the downside is that TuneCore is not a one-time fee like CD Baby. They actually charge you annually. So if you stop paying the fee, your albums will just disappear from streaming. Oh well. So I go through the process yet again of typing in all my weird song titles, all 53 of them, enter a bunch of publisher and songwriter info, and finally get through all the steps and hit submit. Thank God it is over. But no, it is not over. Later that day, I get a message that my album has been flagged and put on hold because of the album title. I'm like, okay. So I log in and I discover that it's not because the album title was too long, which is what I expected the problem to be. It's because they considered it a soundtrack because of the title From a Cheap Amusement Park for Robots and Aliens. They thought it was an actual soundtrack from an actual amusement park for robots and aliens, which is amazing. As if there's an amusement park out there for robots and aliens. But I don't know, maybe there is and I just haven't heard of it. So I wrote back, no, that title is correct. There's actually no amusement park. It's just the name of the album. And they wrote back, okay, thank you for clarifying. And they put it back into action. And then they took it back out of action. A few hours later, again, I get an email from this person. Your release has been flagged and placed on hold due to the cover art being an unauthorized usage. I'm like, what? This cover art has been on the album since 1998. I was there as Flail Tenacious drew it for me in an all-night restaurant. I think it was probably in Perkins or Wags at the time, South Venice. So I wrote back to them again. Thank you for your concern, but the artwork on my album is authorized. Nope, they respond that I need to prove to them I am allowed to use it. Now, I don't know if they have some kind of bot or algorithm that searches the web and tries to flag artwork that it thinks is copyrighted, or maybe they just figure the artwork is so cool, there's just no way I could have the right to use it. So I get back in touch with my artist, Flail Tenacious, after many years, and I'm now asking him to type up a document stating I have the right to use his art on my album that's been out for over 20 years. And I'm hoping that will satisfy the folks at TuneCore. But I'm definitely bracing myself for what's next. Are they gonna say my Carl King drumming was bad on track 42, which it was? Or that I used a direct into the board bass tone on Broccoli because I didn't own an amp? Because that's also true. Or that I can't end a song on a diminished chord? We will find out, won't we? Won't we? All right, enough of that. Let's get into some listener questions, as Cal Newport likes to say. First question is from Spidermind. And Spidermind asks, you seemed to have some strong opinions on certain music in the past, like Tool, The White Stripes, Rage Against the Machine. I was wondering how your perspective has evolved. It seems many of us have strong opinions when we are young. Have you ever had a musical unification moment? Is there a different way you acclimate and consume music now, or maybe not? Here's my answer, Spidermind, or Spidermind. Not sure what a unification moment is, but I can tell you how my perspective has changed over time. Specifically, my perspective on being judgmental about music and the people who listen to it. You mentioned the Dr. Zoltan videos I made making fun of Tool and the White Stripes and Rage Against the Machine. And to my knowledge, those are no longer available anywhere, and I'll probably keep it that way. I made those videos in my landlord's backyard in Culver City with my laptop's webcam when I had just moved to Los Angeles, and I was trying to find my creative voice again. It was this confusing process of reinventing my musical persona from Sir Millard Mulch to Dr. Zoltan Ubelisk for a few different reasons, which I won't go into at this moment because that's totally unrelated to your questions. So back when I made those videos, I was a pretty volatile and neurotic person who spent a lot of time angry about what other people were doing. For instance, I could hear one annoying guitar solo on the radio and be in a bad mood for the rest of the day. Looking back, it was pretty childish, but that's just how I was at the time. So back to the videos. For the record, I never actually had anything against Tool. I was actually making fun of someone I knew, so it was really just an inside joke and kind of using Tool as the mask for it. Anyway, I was writing those essays and attacking popular bands partially sort of as a social experiment and as an entertainment stunt. But deep down, I was envious that those bands were getting all that attention because I definitely wanted to succeed like they had. But since then, I've worked through a lot of my more acute ego problems. They were not cute ego problems. They were simply acute. I'd say getting into secular Buddhism has helped me a lot, and accepting that my personal tastes are not objective reality is also a big one. It's like, just let people like what they like. It doesn't have any effect on me. If I don't like it, then I just won't listen to it. It's that whole live and let live thing. Trying to be, quote, non-judgmental. Because it's something that can get totally carried away and serve no purpose, like an addiction. Also, this idea that we have no free will has given me a lot of peace. Anyway, Spidermind or Spidermind, I hope that all answers your questions about Dr. Zoltan and how my views have evolved over the years. Question number 2 is from Modiak, Modiak. The question is, why do you hate the first 3 letters of your name? Is it because the L is the only thing blocking the car from the king? I think that's a great observation, but you know what, Modiak? I don't know how to answer that question, really. But I will talk about the name Carl King for a little bit. You might not believe this, but I've always found it hard to say my name. Whenever I tell it to someone, I aggressively spell it out because inevitably the person will say, Gar? Carlin? Keen? Or Keenan? Gar Keenan? Carlin Keen? I've also had more than one person make the joke that my name is like a mixture between Carl's Jr. and Burger King, which is finally why I got around to designing a logo for myself, blending those two fast food logos. You can see that on my Discord server, trying to think of where else you could see it. But by the way, if anyone out there wants to join my little community on Discord where we share links to music and paranormal videos, head over to carlkingdom.com, and at the top you'll see a link that says Discord, and that should take you to it. If you're not familiar, Discord is a really cool mixture between AOL Instant Messenger and an old-style web forum where people can talk about different subjects, but it also has a lot of multimedia capabilities like Zoom. Anyway, back to addressing Modiak's question, while also not addressing his question. I used to be embarrassed by my name, Carl King, and think it was nerdy, like Clark Kent. So when I was 17, I started officially going by Millard, which is my middle name. And people would ask me about my unusual first name, Millard. And I'd say, oh, I go by it because my real first name is Nerdy. And I'd tell them my first name, and they would laugh because what name could be more nerdy than Millard? So thank you for your question, Modiak, even though I didn't really answer it. Question number 3 is from Lilac Shadow Soul. Wow. Question is, do you like to read books? And if so, what books are you reading lately? Well, let me pop open my Kindle account here and tell you. I've been checking out some books on writing since I've been working on some books and also doing this podcast regularly, trying to improve my writing skills. Okay, so my recent items are Writing Tools by Roy Peter Clark, On Writing Well by William Zinsser, and several short sentences about writing by Verlin Klinkenborg. I didn't make that up. To be honest, that book was actually too philosophical and abstract for me. I couldn't understand much of it, but maybe someone out there will have better luck than I did. I haven't had the time to dig into all those books yet, but I also intend to revisit Elements of Style by Strunk and White because it's probably been a decade, and I think my writing is evidence of that. You can ask Chris Higgins if he agrees. Now, the last physical book I bought was actually a couple of weeks ago, and it was Sapiens, the graphic novel by Yuval Noah Harari. And from what I can tell so far, it's about the beginning of the universe and also giant wombats. Now, if I'm going to buy physical books, I like it to be something that's better for reading in physical printed form, like a graphic novel, because I think those are actually really difficult to read in digital form. You have to sort of zoom in and pan across the page in this really strange way. And I'm also a person who does a ton of highlighting in my Kindle books because I like to be able to go back and quickly review or search through the notes I took. And I read almost entirely nonfiction, mostly business related or books to improve myself, or at least try. I actually have a blog entry on carlkingdom.com called 5 Books to Read, which you can search for over there if you're interested to find out what some of my favorites are. Or they're at least the books I often recommend to people. Thank you for the question, Lilac Shadow Soul. Is that a bard name? Are you a bard? Because there's definitely like a fantasy thing going on lately. This podcast must be popular with the LARPers. Either way, if you are a fantasy person or not a fantasy person, if you've got an answer, Carl King will question it. Just send it to ask@carlkingdom.com. Today, the Carl King podcast has a guest segment. I'm trying out the idea of having shorter, dedicated portions where a creative individual will share something rather than an open-ended interview. And we'll see how that works out. Have you ever met a famous guitarist? I've met some, but I haven't met as many as Dale Turner has. Dale Turner is a rock singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, and film composer. His album, Mannerisms Magnified, is totally unbelievable. He sang and played all the instruments himself, and you've got to hear it, so go look it up. Mannerisms Magnified. I'm telling you, you won't be disappointed. So in the 90s and 2000s, Dale worked for Guitar World, Guitar for the Practicing Musician, and also a magazine called Guitar One, which brought him face-to-face with tons of guitar gods I'm sure you've heard of. And it just so happens he stopped by my studio, parked his car backwards, and shared some behind-the-scenes stories. So Dale Turner, your guest segment begins now. Tell us what you've got.
So in this period between 1997 and 2007, in a Guitar magazine, which used to be Guitar for the Practicing Musician, Guitar One, possibly Guitar World, but I forget, for 10 years, one of my duties was interviewing a bunch of my all-time favorite guitar pickers, which was a blast, though it does seem like a previous life. In that era, interviews were conducted in person, over the phone, and rarely over email. The trick and bummer with these, though, is almost zero of them were filmed because if you think about it, back then, YouTube was born in like 2005. The only time people would film interviews is if they're going to use the actual video. And it wasn't until way later when we started to have a DVD with our magazines or even feature some of the footage on our website that we would actually bother filming these. So most of these, all of them ended up in print in the magazine. I have audio recordings, of course, of all these. Because it was a print magazine, though, that means you got a hard word count that you can't exceed. So inevitably, there's stuff that ends up being left on the cutting room floor. So hopefully some of them outtakes I can dredge up in my skull and throw down with today.
So I heard that you interviewed Buckethead. Can you tell me about that?
Buckethead, I'd met, I guess you could call it met, a few times at NAMM. Stalked might be another way to say it. I would walk around, trail along with him and talk at him because when he's Buckethead, he's in character, and the only time you hear his voice is through Herbie, that nutty hand puppet that he made. One of these times, I actually slipped him my Guitar Magazine business card. Lo and behold, a few months later, I actually get a call from his publicist, and an interview has been scheduled. Of course, the kooky thing about that is he would only do this particular interview through email, which, of course, would allow him to stay in character and not blow the mystique of Buckethead, even though everybody knew Brian Carroll was his name. Way later, he did start to do interviews in person, but this, again, is between 97 and 2007 I'm talking about. I think this particular thing was 2005, but I'm not sure. Every interview I've ever done, obviously, I researched the player like crazy. In the majority of cases, though, these are some of my all-time favorite players to begin with, so I'm already pretty dialed in with what their playing style involves. So getting questions relating to their playing is pretty easy. This particular interview was a combination of regular interview, just like Q&A type style thing about whatever topic related to his release and history. But there was also a lesson aspect to this. So I typed up a very specific list of questions for the guitar lesson part that I hoped he would tick off and do his thing, and then a regular part of the interview as well. Cool thing is, a while later, I get a DVD from Buckethead with time code on it and everything, and he filmed himself doing every single question I'd asked about a particular lick, topic, approach, song, whatever. And the hilarious thing is, we were able to include that excerpts of it that I chopped out based on the time code and put it on our, I believe, DVD in the magazine at the time, which then, of course, instantly got ripped off and put on YouTube, which, is the way it goes. So if you hit YouTube and surf out Buckethead lesson, the thing that you're going to see where it's Buckethead standing in a stairwell in a yellow raincoat, obviously in his Buckethead garb, doing a huge variety of his cool multi-finger tapping things, shreddy picking stuff, riffs, octave displacement, hybrid picking, all cool stuff. And occasionally you'll see in the right corner, figure 1, figure 2. All of that coincides with the interview that I got to do. All of that was transcribed in our magazine. So if you know what examples or what video I'm talking about, maybe you could hit a back issue or something. Get the tabs if you want. But yeah, that was definitely cool and lives on in cyberspace, in addition to the paper factor that's the entire interview. Oh yeah, and I even got to transcribe everything that Herbie said, which is pretty funny, and that would only be in the magazine.
And again, Herbie was like his hand puppet?
Yeah, Herbie is that hand puppet where he's talking like this. I can't do his voice, but it's kind of in the ballpark like that. If you add in like slurping sounds and other, diseased larynx factor.
And what about Paul Gilbert? Paul Gilbert
rules. First time I interviewed Paul Gilbert was when he lived in Las Vegas, but he drove out to Los Angeles and we met at my friend's photography studio. Gilbert had been driving, obviously himself, the whole time, hands on the steering wheel, however long that drive is, 6 hours, 7 hours, I forget. He gets out of the car. I brought my amp. He plugs into my amp. Instant shredding madness. Like no warm up, no nothing. Perpetual road chops. So that was the first thing that, like, holy crap. Because, I know road chops, that is a real phenomenon. People that are constantly touring, constantly playing, constantly having to be on. At some point, the need to warm up doesn't really exist for them, and they're instantly able to just destroy. So that was pretty obvious in the case of him.
Do you remember what guitar he brought? He brought his own guitar, right?
Yeah, he, I believe, brought 2 guitars. I know for sure he brought his giant white Ibanez double neck because I have a photo of me holding it with him dwarfing me from that first interview. And that double neck, if I remember correctly, the bottom neck, he had 3 D strings tuned in octaves put into the middle of the neck so he could do all of his string skipping, shreddy, brutal arpeggio stuff, but kind of stay in one position and each string being an octave apart. So it's pretty sick, ripping stuff. And then the top neck was just a regular neck, I think, tuned down a whole step. So one oddball thing that I remember that was shocking that would not translate from just reading. Oh yeah, by the way, this of course was a similar thing where it would be a regular interview, but then separately a lesson. What a shame, which is super cool getting to interview, to do some deep probing, picking vocabulary, finger finesse type of discussions and see these pickers like 3 feet away from me was pretty deadly. So at some point, I think the subject of incorporating chromaticism into lead lines came up. I don't remember why. It might have been because he talked about how he got into what he calls the Ace Frehley scale, which is a 3-note per string sort of chromaticizing version of the blues scale. So he was doing something with that, but then he started to talk about how other people take chromaticism into the extreme, and he said, I don't know why some people just don't do this. And he started to just pick super quickly on one string and just slide his index finger around, but in a jagged rhythmic way that sort of tried to outline a line. But because he's sliding across a bunch of frets super quick, it sounded like chromatic passing tones. And me just saying that does not do it justice, but it was one of the sickest things I've ever heard. Would have had to have been there. I, of course, do also have that recorded, but it's also one of those things that's untranscribable, which, of course, was another part of my job, which is cool, transcribing all the stuff that these beasts threw down. One other weird thing I remember is he did bring up this point that I thought was funny, is that he was just interviewed by a guitar magazine in Japan, and the interviewer asked him, or it wasn't really a question, it was more of a statement, Yngwie, he has a style, and he listed some other people, but it seems like you have no style. So he started to, I think this was one of those outtake things. Anyway, it's funny how he was having to defend himself for having a style, which is weird. And we talked about Sean Lane and like a billion other things that would all be cutting room floor stuff. But yeah, he's one of my favorites.
Okay, Steve Vai. Everybody knows that Steve Vai is my favorite guitarist, favorite musician in the world. He actually was on the first episode of this podcast doing an interview. What can you tell me about your experience interviewing Mr. Vi.
Well, I second the favorite factor. Yeah, longtime fave. I got to interview that feller 3 times. The first 2 times at his home in Encino, and then the other time I think was at Mate's rehearsal studio. So I'll just narrow this down to the Encino environment. Here's a funny thing. Of course, I'm pretty much always on time. And I arrive early to not be late. You know how that goes. I parked on the street, which is a pretty major street, waiting so I wouldn't be late. And I put some money in the meter, and I look at the meter number, and the meter number is 666. And of course, I already knew Steve Vai's birthday is 6660. So given that was the very first time I was going to interview a hero of mine, I figured, okay, that's a positive omen. So this first interview was in 99, I believe, so quite a ways back. I think it's when the Ultrazone came out, which is one of my top 5 or 6 Steve Vai albums of all time. Pretty much everything that I went for in that interview ended up in the giant magazine feature. I even got him talking about his birthday, which from my knowledge up to that point, he'd not really addressed. You know, the fact that he was born on 6/6/60. So he did say some funny stuff about how when he was a kid, when The Omen came out, the movie, that he was tripping hard and his friends were making fun of him because they knew his birthday. So the interview itself is kick-ass. To me, it was like one of the ultimate tributes to one of my all-time favorite musicians ever. You just have to read it. If you're a fan of Vai, you would know exactly where I'm coming from and what I was trying to contain into one multi-paged magazine interview. The cool thing about Guitar One in particular, these were not little 1.5-page interviews. They'd be like 10-page beasts. Super, super cool. The end of that interview, everybody knows that Steve Vai is also a bee wrangler. And this, I think, was maybe semi-early into his bee farming. And so he went into the kitchen and came out with a jar of Fire Garden honey, which had his 2 sons on a picture of them on the jar of honey itself. I still have that jar of honey. I'm never going to open it. It's a sacred item to me. Steve Vai's Fire Garden honey.
And how about Yngwie Malmsteen?
Anybody who's read guitar magazines since like 1983 or 1984, when Yngwie first started getting ink, at some point, they noticed that some of the commentary coming from him would be brutalizing his fellow picking peeps. I know exactly how that started to happen. It was a trend, no different than stupid journalists in any form of industry, where once one person says something controversial, every other journalist tries to dredge up the same crap out of that artist to try to put that in their own magazine, TV program, whatever. Very easy to bait the hook with Yngwie and get him to just rag on all these other guitar players, other styles of music. There's no way in hell I was going to waste his time doing that. He instantly knew I was a fan, instantly knew I respected him, clearly trusted me because I wasn't going to drag him into that BS. So we totally got to go deep every time we had our little adventure there. I'd seen Yngwie live like 1 billion times, believe it or not, since his very first Rising Force tour in Seattle, which is way back, right after he left Alcatraz. And I'd never seen him play actual blues live. He had yet to really do Red House as part of his set. I knew on some of the Alcatraz songs that were more straight ahead rock, he would go into like intense blues rock with the Phase 90 that were more like Van Halen-ish blues, chopsy stuff with balls that was killer. But all of a sudden, in one of the interview lessons, he went off playing the most kick-ass, screaming, ballsy, authentic, legit blues I don't want to say that I'd ever heard. I'm adding a couple extra adjectives to differentiate him from other players. The screaming on fire aspect for 15 minutes, just destroying. Occasionally there'd be some inappropriate, weird chromatic scale thing, which is like, what the fuck? I actually was freaking out, and I've been a fan of his forever. So I started to try to convince him to do a blues album. I guess for real, we did. This is not in the interview at all. I mean, I put a little bit of the blues stuff as a transcription thing and like had him talk a little bit about it. But I went deep on trying to get him to not have one of those falsetto metalhead goofball yodelers that he started to have. Jeff Scott Soto is killer. Plus, again, we're talking about blues. There's certain vocal quality that ain't going to work when you're trying to do a blues thing really. beg this guy to come out with some kind of blues cover album, different guest vocalists, who knows. Hilariously, maybe 2 years ago, he did finally come out with a blues album, except I think he's singing, right?
I've never heard that.
Yeah, there is a blues album that he came out with, I think like right before COVID kicked off or like early into it. I don't know. I've been kind of out of the loop with some of this stuff, but
if that really happened, I'm going to have to check that out. That sounds really interesting.
Definitely interesting. However, to be honest, the stuff that he was doing, this particular, back and forth, it doesn't compare. Anything he does is always going to be cool, but this, just him playing by himself, I was just blown away. It was, because if people really know what blues is not just a pentatonic sequence played quickly.
Oh, yes, it is.
5 notes and the truth. So very specific natural mixtures of major pentatonic, minor pentatonic, blues scale, position shifty, slidey, rhythmic, all sorts of stuff outlining chord changes. It was sick.
I understand you even met Dimebag Darrell from Pantera.
Man, crazily, that was actually on his birthday, which is in a way, I didn't realize this, of course, because he passed away somewhat shortly after that. For a while, I thought I got to interview him on his last birthday, but I believe it was his second to last. Either way, obvious freaking tragedy, because he was shot December 8th, which is, of course, the same date John Lennon was shot. I guess I could just say a quick little birthday nugget, because this was kind of funny. He, at the end of the interview, had a hairstylist coming to his home, which I was like, what the hell? And at first I thought, oh, he's going to get made up for his birthday. But it was pretty obvious the reason, because his hair had some issues. The night before, he was at a hookah bar, like that big smoking pipe thing. And I guess it was one of those places where there's big candles on fire. Flames. And he fell asleep in the chair and his hair caught fire. So he had this big melted clump of hair that needed to be chopped out. And so that's what the stylist was going to do. So
you also interviewed George Lynch of Dokken fame. And I heard you have a pretty crazy story about this one.
George Lynch, another one of my all-time favorite pickers ever. Twice I did interviews with him, and they were both lessons. The first one was insane because I went to his house in Arizona where he lived at the time. Imagine this. There is a Rat concert that night in Arizona. So I get to go see the band Rat with George Lynch, which was obviously kick-ass. As we're driving to the concert, though, that's when I'm interviewing him. I got my recorder, I'm talking at him, going through all this totally awesome stuff about, that moment in time with what he was currently doing, but a bunch of historical stuff, one of which, up to that point, I'm positive had not been discussed, and it's how many times he tried to get into Ozzy. So George Lynch auditioned for Ozzy before Randy Rhoads was in the band. Like, that's common knowledge. But what wasn't common knowledge was after Randy passed away, and they had Brad Gillis briefly and all that stuff ensued, George Lynch was in Ozzy briefly. He had quit Dokken to do this. I might be paraphrasing, obviously. So he's rehearsing at SIR with the full band. However, and I don't remember if this detail was put in the interview or not, but I still remember it pretty clearly. He was not getting paid by Dokken because he'd quit, so he had to take an extra job to make ends meet at that point. So he'd taken a side job as a truck driver, and they made him cut his hair. So he had to cut his hair to keep the job as a truck driver, and he goes into rehearsal after cutting his hair, and I can't remember if it was Ozzy or Sharon, instant cold shoulder, why'd you cut your hair? The next thing you know, Jakey Lee is standing there. And that was that.
What was it like being in the home of Slash from Guns N' Roses?
Slash was a kick-ass dude I'd interviewed also 4 times. Easily the most normal, down-to-earth, cool rock star person I'd ever had, the privilege of getting to hang with. First time interviewing him at his home, which was where Snake Pit Studios originally was, right off the kitchen, was a giant glass terrarium. Huge floor to ceiling filled with snakes. So that's why, and underneath that, underground, was the studio, which is why they called it Snake Pit Studios, the name that he later gave to his first solo band, Snake Pit. So one thing I'll share that was a trip is we're listening. Oh, this is another one where I did not have an advance of the album. So I got to listen to I think this was relating to a Snake Pit release. Listen to the album on Slash's couch, and as he's playing his album, he leaves. And he explained why he was leaving, and you'll dig this. He was leaving because he can't listen to his own shit without constantly feeling like, oh, I wish I did this different. I wish this was louder. Oh, this sounds like crap. Constant harping on his own, internal what ifs crap. And he knew that about himself, and he didn't want to let that poison the well, I guess, which I know you and I can fully relate to. So he knew to just hit the road. So that was pretty humanizing, I thought.
Why don't you tell me about your chat with Dave Navarro?
So Dave Navarro, of course, everybody knows from Jane's Addiction, and then I guess Porno for Pyros and Chili Peppers for that one record. This was in the Capitol Records studio right there on Vine. In the middle of our interview, I should back up and say several people that I've gotten to interview, they brought their famous girlfriends, so I got to meet some of these people. And some other people did like bizarre things in front of me. Not him, but like drugs and all sorts of weird crap. Totally strange that people would think that was cool. None of the people we're talking about today, obviously, anything like that. Anyway, so Dave Navarro's phone goes off. He answers it, of course, starts talking, and then he hangs up and he's like, yeah, that's my girlfriend. I had to explain to her where Capitol Records is. Obviously a giant landmark. So in the middle of our interview, there's a knock at the door. Door opens. There's this gal with like giant Elton John mirrored glasses and a huge sun hat. Dale, this is Carmen. She takes off her glasses and hat. Like, holy shit, actually Carmen Electra. This is before anybody knew. It was not known that they were a thing. It's like 1999 or 2001, I guess, super early. So getting to hang out with Carmen Electra, have her, on my goofy little recorder, pretty funny. Random thing I will say that was cool is at some point, and you'll appreciate this, I believe, he started to talk about this book that he made or had been working on when he was recovering from his whole addiction hell, and he was kind of holed up in his own home for a couple of years. He would either sneak out or have somebody else go out and bring a oddball back to his home, and he would take a picture of them in his photo booth that would be like one of those amusement park photo booths. And then he would interview them. He got enough of this to where eventually he somehow got to put out a coffee table book of this stuff. Awesome book. It wasn't out at the time, but the moment it came out, I, of course, bought it. It's got Iggy Pop. It's got Angeline, if you can imagine. So somebody went back and brought Angeline to his house.
And how about Frank Gambale from Chick Corea Band?
Frank Gambale, just a thing that would not translate from the interview itself. Interviewed him a couple times. This is his house in Hollywood. Pinball machines everywhere, super cool. What people wouldn't realize is the ass-kicking, wicked, doomsday economy picking, sweet picking, multi-octave, fistful of brutality crap that he was playing, all on a steel string acoustic, not plugged in, and flawless. I couldn't freaking believe it. Unlike anybody else that was into that type of picking, there's always a percentage of palm muting they're doing because they can't separate the notes with their fret hand, stuff that keeps compromising the tone downstream from however their hands are operating. Perfectly beautiful tone, perfectly synchronized. One of the sickest things I've ever seen, like up close.
And last, what do you remember about meeting John Frusciante of Red Hot Chili Peppers?
John Frusciante probably is one of my all-time favorite interviews ever, along with like Brian Wilson, who I interviewed, but that wasn't really a guitar interview. But as far as like that I have a deep personal, I don't know, some kind of weird connection with in my own head, always meant a lot to me. And I got to interview him right after he got back in the band, after he almost died, which most people know about if you're a Chili Peppers fan. And this was ended up being a revelatory interview, apparently, because of the stuff that he said in there. I used to print out the guitar lesson interview and give it to my first year music theory students at Musicians Institute, because it became obvious from talking to him that he actually did have a legit theory thing in his brain, but actually used it to control his creativity. It wasn't theory first. It'd be stuff that he knew was in his head. It was allowing him to get out stuff in an error-free, flawless way, as he's basically jamming with Flea, that type of stuff, coming up with alternate parts on the spot. At some point, I got him talking about the myth, learning theory kills creativity. And in his own words, he freaking shot that down in the most genius way imaginable. So because of that, I made sure that my first quarter theory kiddos that might have that same kind of disease of, well,
I don't know. I don't really want to learn theory, because my cousin said it's just going to make me crappy and it's going to ruin my songs.
or whatever, garbage people have in their head. So yeah, I used to, like I said, print that out and give it to my first quarter theory students so they would not have the hang up that most people have when the theory topic gets thrust upon them. He would call me while he was on tour. So he would care so much about trying to help people learn and get deeper as an artist or whatever, that he would think about crap we talked about, and then he would call and either try to rephrase something or add something. Nobody would have expected that of somebody that's a, high level, touring beast like that. I will say a thing that was obvious from getting to hang with him. He didn't ever drive. Didn't have a car. I mean, maybe he had a car, but he was never driving. Didn't have a driver's license. He cared about literally nothing except trying to be in the most creative frame of mind at all times, and removed everything from his life that would fuck with that. It was very obvious that he went out of his way to delete anything that would suck him out of that constant creative being feeling. So that was a trip to behold, because it was obvious that he was making that possible, which obviously we know is not easy to do, but kudos to him for dialing it in.
Well, thank you for sharing that stuff, Dale. Listeners, I'm talking to you now. Find out more about Dale Turner at intimateaudio.com. That's intimateaudio.com. And be sure you park backwards. Sunday, July 24th, 2022 was a historical day for me because I saw a robot at a crosswalk going across the street by itself. Now, this sort of thing is new to me, but apparently it's been going on for a few years now. My understanding is the robot was delivering some food, but what I wonder is, do we really need this? Neil Postman famously said, "What is the problem to which this technology is the solution?" And I'm going to repeat that because it's a great quote. What is the problem to which this technology is the solution? In the case of these delivery robots, there isn't one. It's not like, man, if we only had a robot to bring us some food, because we already have delivery people. So there's really no problem to solve there. It's not helping customers. It's more like it's just a gimmick or a marketing novelty. Because, hey, it got me talking about it here on this podcast. Now, I like robots in movies. I've even named a bunch of my creations after robots. Actually, I've always felt like maybe I am a robot myself. But in real life, they creep me out. I was in my neighborhood a while back, and up ahead of me there was a Tesla that seemed to be having difficulty doing a 3-point turn. And as I drove up to it, I realized there was no one in it. The self-driving car was just on its way to pick up its driver a couple of houses away, and it almost crashed into me, which was really stupid. We've also got this self-checkout thing, and sorry if I sound like I'm doing a Jerry Seinfeld comedy bit here, but grocery stores have tricked us into working for them for free. Are they going to ask us to come in and stock the shelves too while we're at it? Unload the trucks at 4 a.m.? I think it's all a trick. It's like we want to go use these stupid things because, hey, that's neat. But ultimately, it's just another way for a corporation to cut costs and increase profits. They're definitely not doing it to make our lives better. Now, I'm sure there are people out there who prefer this self-checkout system, maybe to distance from other people, perhaps because of COVID. But I can't imagine that most people like bagging their own groceries. I'm an introvert and I don't like talking to cashiers, but I think this whole thing is a hassle. But maybe I'm wrong about all this technology stuff. Maybe delivery robots don't benefit us right now, but maybe they're just a step in developing an actual useful technology. Or it's a sign that I'm getting old, that I'm skeptical about any of this fancy new stuff. But just to prove I'm not always an old man screaming at robots, there are a few inventions that Carl King is thankful for. For instance, my Apple Watch that tracks my heart rate and blood oxygen level. And there's this app called Waze. I don't know if you've heard of that. These things actually benefit me. Maybe in the development of all useful technologies, we have to work our way through some version of seemingly stupid delivery robots and self-checkout. But I really have no idea. Until then, I'm going to do my best to just avoid robots. Okay, that's it for this episode, Carl King listeners. Remember, to support this show, head over to patreon.com/Carl King and subscribe for $1 a month or $5 a month. Or if you're a very good friend of Carl King, like Chubode and Hank Howard III, you can go for the Archmage level of $50 a month or more and get your name listed here right along with them. Thanks for listening, everybody. And remember, don't snore too hard because it's bad for you. Good night.